He followed every rule, booked early, paid in full, held the highest loyalty status on the airline, and yet, 5 minutes after boarding, he was told, "You need to move. That seat is reserved for someone more important." But what if the man they forced to move was actually the most powerful person on that plane? This isn't just a story about race or class or a seat on an airplane. It's about what happens when calm refuses to be erased, when silence holds its ground, and when the system picks the wrong person to underestimate. Because what came next changed an entire airline from the inside out. Daniel Foster didn't travel with an entourage. No designer luggage, no flashy watch, just a navy blue carry-on, a worn leather laptop case, and a boarding pass with 2A printed in bold. He had flown enough miles to circle the globe several times, yet he always boarded the same way, quiet, efficient, respectful. Today was no different. He'd arrived early, checked in without fuss, and placed his bag overhead before settling into his seat. Seat 2A wasn't a luxury to Daniel. It was the result of hard work and consistency. A space he earned, not because of status, but because he followed the rules, paid on time, and showed up. But it took only a moment for that certainty to begin unraveling. "Excuse me, sir." The voice came from above. Soft, rehearsed. Megan Boyle, the lead flight attendant, stood beside him, her uniform crisp, her tone professional but oddly strained. "We're going to have to ask you to switch seats. We have a VIP boarding who needs this one." Daniel looked up, his expression calm but firm. "This is my assigned seat," he said, voice even. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his platinum member card, and held it up. "I booked early, paid in full. This is where I was placed." Megan glanced at the card but didn't take it. Instead, her eyes shifted just past him, toward the aisle, where Elaine Prescott had begun to approach. Blonde hair in a flawless twist, a cream-colored coat draped over her arm, and a purse that likely cost more than Daniel's entire travel budget for the month. "I always sit there," she murmured loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "every flight." Daniel turned back to Megan. "I understand you have a VIP to accommodate, but I'm not moving. I didn't break any rules. I boarded on time. This is my seat." The air changed, not loudly, not all at once, just a slow tightening of tension, the kind that settled into the space between words. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't passive. It was filled with recognition. Across the aisle, Thomas Lee, 72 years old, retired postal worker, watched quietly. He'd seen this scene before, not on a plane, on sidewalks, in offices, and lunch counters decades ago. The faces were different. The story was the same. They don't see a man, Thomas thought. They see a disruption. Megan hesitated. There was a flicker, maybe doubt, maybe discomfort, but it passed quickly. "Sir, this is a sensitive situation. We're asking for your cooperation." Daniel nodded slightly, as if he'd heard the words before. "Cooperation," he echoed. "Is that what this is?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a mirror. Megan shifted. Behind her, Elaine looked down at her watch, visibly annoyed. The flight was delayed. People were staring. She tilted her head in impatience, as if waiting for a nuisance to be cleared. Daniel didn't move. His hands remained in his lap, one thumb gently circling the edge of his boarding pass. He wasn't challenging anyone. He wasn't performing. He was simply staying, in the seat he had earned, in the moment he refused to surrender. A few rows back, Martha Ruiz, a retired high school teacher, raised her phone. She didn't make a show of it. She just pressed record, quietly, steadily. She'd taught generations of students how to speak up, but sometimes speaking up meant simply refusing to look away. Some passengers avoided eye contact. Others leaned just slightly forward, listening. But no one said anything. Not yet. The silence was its own verdict. Thomas clenched his hands beneath the tray table, not out of fear, but restraint. He remembered the feeling of being asked to move, not because he was wrong, but because someone else was assumed to be more right. Daniel looked once more at Megan. "I'm not moving," he repeated, his voice low and clear. "Because there's no reason I should have to." Megan said nothing. The moment stretched thin, tension drawn across every inch of the cabin. In the quiet, the weight of history pressed against the walls. The aisle lights dimmed slightly as the last of the passengers took their seats, but the air in first class had grown colder. Not in temperature, but in tone. The request for Daniel to move hadn't worked. And the woman who stood just a few feet behind him, Elaine Prescott, was not used to being told no. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and stepped forward, brushing past Megan Boyle with a barely concealed sigh. "There must be something you can do," she whispered, slipping something into Megan's hand with practiced ease. It was folded, small, crisp, and unmistakable. $100 bill, maybe more. Megan hesitated, not long enough to question it, just long enough for someone to notice. That someone was Martha Ruiz. She had seen bribes before. Teaching for 30 years in a district where politics bled into school policy taught her what corruption looked like: subtle, quiet, often polite. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply lifted her phone a little higher and hit record. Elaine leaned in, her voice low but sharp. "He's making a scene," she said, her eyes never leaving the back of Daniel's head. "This is about comfort. You know that." But there was no scene. Daniel hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stood up, hadn't even turned around. He just sat, calm, composed, reading the same boarding pass he had shown Megan minutes before. From the galley, a new figure appeared. Brian Carter, the cabin supervisor, tall and authoritative, approached with an expression that tried to project neutrality, but his tone betrayed it. "Mr. Foster," he said, "we need your cooperation to prevent further delay." Daniel turned to him slowly. "Is there a rule I've violated?" Brian blinked. "We're trying to manage a sensitive situation with discretion. This isn't personal." "Everything about this is personal," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "I followed protocol. I'm in my seat. The only thing unusual here is how hard you're trying to move me out of it." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A man in 2C pulled his headphones down, pretending not to listen. A woman in 3A glanced sideways, catching a brief look of something like shame in Megan's eyes. But no one said a word. The silence was loud. Brian exhaled through his nose, then knelt slightly, as if to speak to Daniel on his level. "Sir, if you refuse to comply, we may have to ask you to deboard the aircraft." "On what grounds?" Daniel asked. "You're disrupting the flight process." Daniel looked around. No one had been delayed, except him. No one had raised a complaint, except Elaine. No one had broken a rule, except perhaps the ones holding their authority a little too tightly. "If that's the story you want to tell," he said, "make sure it's one you can defend." Across the aisle, Thomas Lee shifted in his seat. His jaw was set, his eyes locked forward. "That man's got more composure than anyone I've ever met," he thought, "and that's exactly why they don't know what to do with him." Meanwhile, Martha's recording continued, framed wide enough to catch the exchange, close enough to show the envelope of money being subtly tucked into Megan's apron pocket. Daniel's phone buzzed once. He ignored it. Megan cleared her throat. "Mr. Foster, we'll see what we can do," she murmured, voice barely audible now. "No need," Daniel said. "I'll wait right here." Transitional image. The camera pauses on Brian's hand, hovering over the seat back in front of Daniel, hesitating, unsure whether to press forward or step back. In that frozen moment, you can almost feel the weight of the decision that's about to fall. It took less than 5 minutes for everything to unravel. The plane had gone quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from anticipation, but the heavy, brittle kind that falls when people know something wrong is about to happen, and no one is sure how to stop it. Brian Carter had made his choice. Megan stood a step behind him, her lips tight, eyes no longer meeting Daniel's. And Elaine Prescott? She remained standing near the bulkhead, arms crossed, gaze fixed on her phone like she was above the mess she had helped create. Daniel didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. And that, more than anything, seemed to irritate them most. The 2 security officers who boarded the plane weren't aggressive. They didn't have to be. Their uniforms did the speaking. They made their way down the narrow aisle with that firm, efficient stride, heads forward, hands relaxed but ready. "Mr. Foster," one of them said, voice neutral, "you've been asked to deboard the aircraft." Daniel looked up. He took a breath. "On what grounds?" The officer glanced briefly at Brian, then said, "Failure to comply with crew instructions." The words were routine, practiced, but the lie wasn't subtle. Around him, the atmosphere shifted. Some passengers watched through lowered brows, some with cameras subtly tilted toward the scene. Others stared out the window, pretending not to be involved. But there was no ignoring it now. Not when a man, calm and composed, was being asked to leave a seat he had every right to occupy. Martha Ruiz was still filming. Thomas Lee had not moved since the moment security appeared, but now his jaw clenched. "I've seen this," he thought. "Not in airports, in courtrooms, in lunchrooms, in lobbies. The moment you hold your ground, they decide you're the problem." Daniel's reply was simple: "I won't resist. But I want it noted that I am not being removed for violating any law or policy, only because someone else demanded my seat." The officer nodded. "Understood, sir." Daniel stood slowly. He adjusted his coat, picked up his bag, and turned to face the first-class cabin. For a moment he held their eyes, those who would meet his gaze. Then he walked down the aisle with measured steps, escorted by two men who knew this was wrong, but had stopped asking why long ago. Someone near the back muttered, "This is disgraceful." Another whispered, "Unbelievable." And one woman, young, seated near the middle, shook her head and said, just loudly enough, "First class should have standards." The irony rang like a bell. Martha lowered her phone, but not before capturing Daniel's final glance over his shoulder. It wasn't a glare. It was quiet disappointment. The kind that didn't need volume to land hard. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the video was already being uploaded. Not just by Martha, but by at least 4 others who had filmed from different angles. The story was no longer confined to cabin walls. It was spreading. By the time wheels touched down, Daniel Foster was trending. Across the country, people watched 30-second clips of a composed black man being escorted off a plane. They paused when he calmly said, "This is my seat." They replayed the moment Megan looked down and said nothing. They zoomed in on the blurred image of Elaine sitting smugly in 2A, her privilege settling in like she had just won a silent war. But it wasn't over. The backlash was immediate. The videos reached millions within hours. News outlets picked up the story by morning. Think pieces flooded in. Civil rights attorneys spoke out. Airline analysts began asking quiet questions about policies, partnerships, and hidden biases. Skylux's public relations team scrambled. They issued a bland statement. "We are aware of an incident and are investigating. Passenger safety is our top priority." But the damage was already done. Because sometimes the most powerful protest isn't loud. It's still, measured, refusing to shrink, and the country had seen it live. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Midwest, the turbulence wasn't from the air. It was from the news. Judith Miles, 69, sat in seat 3C with a habit she never dropped since retiring from corporate finance. She read business briefs mid-flight. Normally, that meant scanning economic forecasts or merger rumors. But today it was Twitter. She adjusted her reading glasses, blinked twice, then nudged her husband without looking up. "Martin," she said, voice steady, "you need to see this." The headline was simple. The image beneath it was not. CEO of Nexora AI, Daniel Foster, forcibly removed from Skylux first-class seat despite platinum status. Judith had spent decades navigating boardrooms full of men who judged her by gender before they ever judged her by numbers. She'd seen the game played with sharp smiles and silent dismissals. But this was arrogance bordering on suicidal. Because Nexora wasn't just any company. It was the fastest-growing AI firm in the country. Its technology was already integrated into 3 major airports, including Skylux's own biometric boarding system. Just last month, Judith had watched her CEO and Daniel shake hands on stage, smiling about a possible $50 million enterprise licensing agreement. And now, this. She didn't wait for coffee service. She opened her laptop, connected to in-flight Wi-Fi, and sent a message directly to the company's executive channel. "Check trending. You're going to want to call a meeting. Immediately." In the cabin, Elaine Prescott had finally settled into seat 2A, a glass of white wine in hand, oblivious to the fire she'd helped ignite. She scrolled through her emails, sipped slowly, and didn't notice the quiet urgency building in the rows behind her. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, but a touch too rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you again for flying Skylux. We are aware of an incident that occurred during boarding and are actively reviewing it." That wasn't protocol. Judith knew. She'd been in damage control rooms before. This was the start of something bigger. 30,000 feet below, Skylux's headquarters in Atlanta was already fielding calls from reporters, clients, and investors. The company's stock dipped 3% in the first hour of trading. By noon, it was down 6%. Daniel Foster's name wasn't just trending. It was reverberating. In the corporate conference room, a red-faced VP of client partnerships was flipping through paper copies of Nexora's deal packet. "Tell me this is a different Daniel Foster," he muttered. "It's not," someone said from across the room. "And he wasn't just flying to meet us, he was our keynote." Silence. They hadn't just removed a paying customer. They had humiliated the man they were supposed to be welcoming. The man who held the keys to a multi-million-dollar deal. The man whose company was on the verge of revolutionizing their entire customer data infrastructure. And they had dragged him off a plane like he was nothing. Back on the ground, in Nexora's headquarters in San Jose, Daniel walked into his office, set his phone on the desk, and powered up his monitor. Dozens of messages lit up the screen. Support, outrage, press inquiries, meeting requests, but he didn't rush to reply. He didn't need to, because he knew the story was already bigger than him. In that moment, Daniel didn't feel like a CEO, or a headline, or a symbol. He just felt tired. Not defeated, not angry, just tired of having to explain to the world again and again why being right still wasn't enough. He sat down slowly, looked at the news articles, then at the camera feed from his upcoming press briefing. In one frame, he saw the boardroom at Skylux beginning to fill. Suits, tablets, tension. In another, his own reflection stared back at him. Thomas Lee, now back in his home in Cincinnati, sat in his recliner with the TV on mute. He watched the news scroll silently across the screen. His hand rested on the remote, unmoving. "They thought he was just some guy," he muttered. "Turns out, he was the guy." Transitional image. In a quiet boardroom flooded with daylight, Skylux executives gather around a long table, the Nexora contract lying untouched at its center. No one speaks. In the stillness, the only thing louder than the mistake is the silence that follows it. The boardroom at Skylux headquarters wasn't designed for humility. It was a space built on ego. Glass walls, chrome fixtures, a polished table that stretched longer than some studio apartments. Normally, it echoed with confidence. Deal pitches, market forecasts, high-flying numbers. Today, it echoed with something else. Silence. Every executive in the room had seen the video. Not the one edited for the evening news. The raw, uncut footage from Martha Ruiz's phone. It was being passed between departments like contraband. They watched the calm man in seat 2A remain seated, voice measured, eyes unwavering, as he was asked, then pressured, then escorted out. They knew that face now. Knew the name. Daniel Foster. CEO of Nexora AI, multi-patent holder, guest lecturer at MIT, alumni keynote at Stanford, and until 36 hours ago, their most important prospective partner. They also knew that no one from Skylux had contacted him yet. The door opened. Daniel entered without announcement. No assistant, no entourage. Just a charcoal gray suit and a calmness that unnerved them more than any lawyer could have. He didn't sit at the far end. He didn't shake hands. He placed his phone on the table and looked at them, all of them. "Let's not waste each other's time," he said. The room held its breath. Chairman Landry, usually the loudest voice in the building, tried to smile. "Mr. Foster, Daniel, we want to extend our sincerest." Daniel raised one hand, not aggressively, just enough. "No apologies," he said, "until you understand what you're apologizing for." Landry froze. Daniel continued, "This isn't about one seat or one employee. This is about a system that works exactly the way it was designed to, efficient, polite, and quietly humiliating." One of the legal advisors opened their mouth, then closed it. "I didn't ask for headlines," Daniel said. "I asked for a boarding pass, and I got one. What I didn't ask for was a performance of authority pretending to be policy." Someone at the far end cleared their throat, trying to pivot. "We'd still like to explore a way forward with Nexora. Perhaps a revised partnership." Daniel leaned slightly forward. "You're not in a position to revise anything." His words weren't loud, but they landed like a gavel. Thomas Lee watched from his living room again, this time with the volume turned up. He'd seen men like Daniel before, rarely but enough to recognize something in the posture. "He's not negotiating," Thomas murmured. "He's educating." Back in the boardroom, Daniel took a breath. "This isn't about revenge. I don't need to destroy your company. The world is doing that just fine without my help." He paused. "But I do need to decide whether I can trust Skylux with the future of my business. That stung deeper than any lawsuit." Landry tried again. "We've already terminated the staff involved, the flight attendant, the supervisor, even the captain. We took swift action." Daniel nodded once, but not with approval. You treated the symptoms, not the infection. The line cut through the room. This isn't about a few bad decisions, he continued. It's about an entire culture that allowed those decisions to feel normal. He stood. The only reason I'm here is because some of your employees stayed silent, and some of them hit record. He picked up his phone, glanced at it briefly, then looked back to the board. I'll make this simple. You don't get the deal. Pause. But you do get the opportunity to show your company, your employees, your customers, and yourselves that you're not beyond learning. I've already begun designing a protocol overhaul, new policies, mandatory anti-discrimination training, full transparency and passenger grievance reviews, and I will be appointing the advisory team myself. Eyes widened. And one more thing, Daniel said. You'll make this public. Not as a press release, as a promise. Chairman Landry asked the only question he had left. Why would you still want to work with us? Daniel finally smiled, just slightly. Because if I only partnered with companies that got everything right, I'd never change anything. When the press release dropped, it wasn't a footnote. It was a bomb. Skylux Airlines confirmation of flight attendant Megan Boyle, cabin supervisor Brian Carter, and Captain Raymond Whitaker, following internal review of discrimination incident involving Nexora CEO Daniel Foster. The article went live at 9:03 a.m. By 9:07, screenshots were already circulating across business Slack channels, Reddit threads, and group chats from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. For 3 employees who once moved through the world with quiet confidence, the fall wasn't slow. It was immediate, complete, and public. Megan Boyle read the news alone in her apartment, shades drawn. The email had come through hours earlier. A cold, standard HR notification of contract termination, effective immediately. But seeing her name in national headlines made it real. Her phone buzzed with missed calls. Some were from friends, others from unknown numbers she didn't dare answer. She opened her LinkedIn app out of habit, then froze. Her profile photo still wore the Skylux badge. But the comments, they didn't. One said, "So this is what following orders looks like when nobody questions why." Another, "Good luck finding work when your face is attached to the textbook example of bias." And then, just 2 words, "You chose." Brian Carter didn't wait for HR. He knew the moment Daniel walked into the boardroom, it was over. His instinct had always been to control the room, manage the optics, but nothing could prepare him for the call he got that morning. Not from Skylux, but from his alma mater. "We'll be removing your name from our alumni spotlight page. This doesn't reflect who we are." Captain Whitaker had flown planes through hurricanes, once landed on 2 blown tires in Istanbul. But no amount of training prepares you for a reputation that unravels in a single news cycle. He turned in his badge before the airline could demand it. Quietly, alone. The walls of his home office now echoed with the silence of a man realizing too late that doing nothing was doing everything wrong. Meanwhile, inside Skylux headquarters, the HR director stood at the edge of another emergency meeting, voice even but eyes sharp. "We failed," she said. "But not just as a company, as individuals, because we saw a man removed for no reason, and we didn't stop it until it became inconvenient." The final slide in her presentation wasn't a flowchart or a damage control memo. It was a name, Daniel Foster. Underneath it, one line, largest individual shareholder of Skylux Airlines. Gasps weren't heard, but felt. Back in Cincinnati, Thomas Lee sat with a coffee he'd forgotten to sip, the morning paper folded in his lap. He reread the line about Daniel's shareholder stake 3 times, then said softly to himself, "They dragged out the man who owns the room." It was more than poetic. It was structural. Daniel hadn't just been wronged. He had leverage. And now the system that quietly escorted him off a plane was publicly collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Elaine Prescott, whose voice had ignited the fire, was harder to reach. Her publicist issued a vague denial. Miss Prescott was unaware of the full situation unfolding and regrets any confusion. But it didn't matter. Her name had already entered the online lexicon. Airline Karen. It trended for 3 days. Memes, satire accounts, TikTok reenactments. She could delete her posts, silence her comments. But she couldn't scrub the truth. She had spoken with entitlement, and now the internet was speaking back. And in the middle of the wreckage, Daniel said nothing. He didn't go on TV. Didn't tweet, didn't retaliate, he worked, while others scrambled to rebuild their names. He was rebuilding something else. The foundation of an airline that, for the first time in decades, was being forced to ask itself not just what it valued, but who. Because when a company's future depends on the person it dismissed, apologies aren't enough. They have to transform. The transformation didn't start with a press release. It started with a room. No glass walls, no executive chairs, just fold-out tables, a whiteboard, and rows of regular employees, baggage handlers, desk agents, crew leads, and 2 custodians sitting near the back because, as they quietly joked, no one ever invites us to meetings like this. But this wasn't a meeting. This was the beginning of something else. Daniel Foster stood at the front, not as a guest, not as a speaker flown in to check a diversity box. He stood there because he'd chosen to stay. And Skylux had chosen to let him rebuild what they broke. His first words weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. "I'm not here to fix the public's opinion of this airline," he said. "I'm here to fix what made that opinion necessary." No applause followed, just quiet attention. The program he introduced wasn't cosmetic. There were no shallow slogans or pastel posters about inclusion. It was policy, rooted, mandatory, and designed to outlast the news cycle. Every employee, from the CEO to part-time seasonal workers, would complete anti-discrimination and bias recognition training. Not once, but every quarter. Passenger complaint review boards were overhauled to include third-party oversight and anonymous auditing. Hiring pipelines were redesigned to prioritize equity, not tokenism, but reach, mentorship, and accountability at every level. And Daniel wasn't just offering recommendations. He was leading the committee that enforced them. Some executives bristled at the structure. They had been taught to manage reputations, not restructure culture. But Daniel never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He had the leverage of logic, data, and public trust. He knew exactly how the system worked and where it failed. And more than that, he knew how to turn it into something better. Across training rooms in Denver, Miami, and Chicago, staff gathered in small groups, watching role-play videos, reflecting on case studies, and for the first time, confronting the small choices that built the bigger problem. It wasn't comfortable, but it was working. In one session, a gate agent named Claire, 41, single mom, 12 years with the airline, paused a video halfway through and said, "I've done that, not out of hate, out of habit. I never questioned it." No one shamed her. No one clapped, they just nodded, because that was the point. Change wasn't about shame, it was about responsibility. In San Diego, a baggage handler named Lionel raised his hand during a session and asked, "Are we really going to do this every quarter?" Daniel happened to be observing that day. He smiled and said, "Only if you want your next promotion to mean something." The room laughed, but the message stuck. And even at the top, behind closed doors where conversations used to revolve around margins and press optics, the language began to shift. Chairman Landry, once the loudest defender of corporate neutrality, now opened leadership meetings with a standing agenda item: people impact. Not just customer satisfaction scores, but real stories. Real feedback, real decisions. Skylux began publishing quarterly accountability reports, not as marketing, but as transparency. They shared the numbers, the good, the bad, the slow progress, the unexpected wins. They let the public track how the system was changing, not just how they said it was changing. One article in Forbes titled "The Turnaround: From PR Disaster to Industry Blueprint, How Daniel Foster Rewired an Airline." But the headline didn't capture the heart of it. The heart was in the small things. Like the new hiring packet handed to every recruit, which now began with this line: "Your title doesn't define your value, your choices do." Or the poster quietly hung in the employee break room in Atlanta, showing a single empty plane seat under a soft reading light. Beneath it, just 5 words: "This seat still has a voice." Back in Cincinnati, Thomas Lee saw the poster online. He saved it, printed it, taped it next to the mirror where he shaved every morning. When his grandson asked what it meant, he said simply, "That's what happens when a man stands his ground long enough for the world to move." At one training session in New York, someone asked Daniel if he ever thought about walking away, about cutting ties with Skylux and watching them fall. He paused before answering. "I did," he said, "but I've spent most of my life watching systems crumble because people walked away." I stayed because someone has to show what it looks like when you fix the house you didn't break. For Megan Boyle, mornings used to begin with a uniform, a crisp shirt, a name badge, and a checklist. She knew the emergency exits by heart, how to smile without showing fatigue, how to diffuse tension with practiced warmth. But now her mornings began with silence and a job board. It had been weeks since the termination. Her savings were thinning. Every interview ended the same way. The moment the hiring manager Googled her name, the conversation shifted. They thanked her for her time, promised to be in touch. They never were. She started lying on applications, used her middle name, removed Skylux from her resume. But the video was everywhere. Even when it wasn't trending, it lived on in algorithmic memory. A legacy not of cruelty, but of quiet compliance. In a job market that forgave nearly everything, complicity still had a cost. Brian Carter fared no better. The former cabin supervisor, once seen as a rising leader within Skylux, now answered phones at a small logistics company outside Dallas. No team to manage, no flights, just a headset, a script, and $12 an hour. He didn't talk about what happened, not to his coworkers, not even to his brother, but he watched every video multiple times, not the edits with dramatic music or hashtags, the raw footage. He saw himself, standing stiffly, asking Daniel to move. Voice flat, eyes low, posture rigid with protocol. Not because he believed it was right, but because it was normal. The way things had always been. And in every playback, he wondered when that normal became acceptable. Across the country, Elaine Prescott's world shrank behind locked accounts and pulled invitations. Her law firm didn't fire her, they just didn't return her calls. Her club didn't revoke her membership, but no one saved her seat at lunch. At first, she was defensive. "I didn't do anything wrong," she told a reporter who reached out for comment. "I didn't ask anyone to be dragged off." But the internet remembered. It remembered her voice, tinged with entitlement. "I always sit there." It remembered the way she looked away as Daniel was removed, the way she settled into his seat like she had won something. Now every time she stepped into a coffee shop, she checked the room. Were they looking? Did they recognize her? Had they watched the video? Her life hadn't ended, but its invisibility had. Back in Cincinnati, Thomas Lee was watching a local news segment about corporate bias training. Skylux was featured. Daniel Foster was mentioned. Thomas turned down the volume and looked at the photo taped to his mirror. That plain seat bathed in soft light. He thought about Megan, about Brian, even about Elaine. They weren't monsters, he murmured, just mirrors. He knew what it felt like to look away. To tell yourself, this isn't my place to speak. He'd done it, more than once, and every time it left a mark. So when his granddaughter, age 16, asked him during dinner, "What would you have done if you were on that plane?" he didn't give the safe answer. He said, "I hope I would have stood up. But maybe I wouldn't have. And maybe that's why I remember it so clearly." Not everyone paid the same price, but everyone paid something. Daniel knew that. He saw the aftermath, not through headlines but through faces. He didn't seek out Megan, but she reached out, not to apologize, just to speak. They met at a small cafe in Chicago. No press, no cameras, just two people on opposite sides of a long month. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said quietly. "I thought I was just following instructions." Daniel nodded. "That's how most injustice happens." She looked at her hands. "I don't know how to fix it." "You don't," he said, "but you face it. That's a start." They didn't talk long, but when she left, Megan walked with less weight. Later that week, she applied for a new job. Entry-level, not in aviation, but with a nonprofit focused on workplace fairness. She didn't lie on the application. She wrote in the cover letter, "I learned the hard way what silence can cost. I'm ready to be useful again." The cameras were already in place when Daniel arrived. It wasn't a press conference. There were no branded backdrops, no choreographed sound bites, just two podiums set up in a modest hall at Skylux's Atlanta Training Center. The room wasn't filled with journalists or shareholders. It was filled with workers. Mechanics in union jackets, flight attendants with hands folded in their laps, janitorial staff still in their shift clothes. Daniel didn't stand on ceremony. He didn't adjust his tie. He simply walked to the front with the same calm he carried on the plane months earlier, except now, the room was ready to listen. "I was taught never to confuse quiet with weakness," he began. Because some of the most powerful changes I've ever seen didn't come from people yelling. They came from people refusing to move. No applause, just stillness. He let the moment settle before continuing. When I boarded that flight, I wasn't looking to make a point. I just wanted a seat and a few hours of peace. What I got instead was a reminder. Fairness doesn't happen just because rules exist. Fairness happens because people protect it, together. Across the crowd, heads nodded. The words weren't abstract, they were lived. I didn't walk away, Daniel said. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I believed this company could become something better. At the exact place where it failed. He stepped back. The new CEO of Skylux took his place beside him. He didn't read from a prepared statement. He didn't defend the past. He simply said, "We failed," and Daniel stayed. That says more than anything we could have said. Behind them, a short video played, not about the incident, but what followed. Footage from retraining sessions, interviews with staff, clips of people talking about dignity like it mattered again. A baggage handler said, "I've worked here 18 years. This is the first time anyone's asked me what I think we should change." When the screen faded, there was no tagline, no corporate anthem, just one quiet message. Change didn't come from policy. It came from people. Back in Cincinnati, Thomas Lee was watching on his living room TV. He saw Daniel up there, standing with ease but not triumph, and thought to himself, that's what strength looks like when it doesn't need to win to be right. The ripple effect of Daniel's stand had long outlived the headlines. Megan Boyle had started working at a nonprofit dedicated to labor fairness. Brian Carter volunteered at a veteran reintegration program. Elaine Prescott remained largely out of public view, but she had sent a handwritten note. No excuses, no spin. Just a sentence that read, "I didn't see what I didn't want to see, and I'm learning how to look differently now." Skylux wasn't perfect, but it had become something rare, a company that didn't just apologize, it changed. New hiring packets opened with a line that read, "Your title doesn't define your value, your choices do." Gate agents were taught to lead with presence, not policy, and every quarter, the company published a transparent dignity report with real passenger stories, not just metrics. And through it all, Daniel stayed involved. Not as a watchdog, not as a hero, but as a builder of trust, of structure, of something more human inside, something once purely corporate. That's what led to this moment, on a stage with no celebration, just purpose. The CEO extended his hand. Daniel took it, not with a smile of victory, but with the resolve of someone who understood exactly what it meant to rebuild something from the ground up. They didn't pose, they didn't linger. The handshake lasted only seconds, but for everyone watching, it said what words no longer needed to. If you've ever been dismissed, silenced, or underestimated, type 1 in the comments. If you believe that quiet integrity still matters, type 2. And if you want more true stories where justice doesn't just speak, but leads, subscribe to our channel and share this video forward. Because change begins the moment someone decides not to walk away. This was never just a story about a seat on a plane. It was about what happens when power is held with calm, when dignity holds its ground, and when accountability becomes more than a slogan, it becomes culture. Because real justice doesn't come from shouting, it comes from the choice to stay, to speak, and to build again, where others would have left.